The weathered boards of the porch creaked beneath the old man's boots. Wade Callahan sat in his favorite chair, the one he'd carved from oak 30 years back when his hands were steadier and his hair hadn't yet turned silver. Spring sunshine painted the Texas prairie gold, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed their afternoon song. The boy beside him was 12 years old with eyes that held too many questions for such a young soul. He'd been staring at the scar on Wade's right hand for the better part of an hour, working up the courage to ask about it the way young boys do when they sense a story worth hearing. "Grandpa Wade," the boy finally said, his voice small against the vastness of the land. "How'd you get that scar?" Wade looked down at his hand. The mark ran from his thumb to his wrist, a pale line that time had faded but never quite erased. 56 years on this earth had given him plenty of scars, but this one carried weight. This one had a story attached that started with a girl in a torn wedding dress and ended with everything that mattered. He let the silence stretch the way old men do when they're deciding how much truth a young mind can handle. A hawk circled overhead. The windmill turned lazy circles, pumping water from the well he'd dug with his own hands. In the studio barn he could see Clara at her easel still painting, after all these years, her hair silver like his, but her hands as steady as ever. "That's a long story, son," Wade said at last. "A story about the day I had to choose between staying safe and doing what was right." The boy leaned forward, and Wade felt the weight of storytelling settle on his shoulders. Some stories needed telling, some lessons needed passing down. That's what legacy was, he'd learned. Not the land you left behind, but the wisdom you planted in young hearts. "It was 15 years ago," Wade began, and his mind drifted back through time like dust through afternoon light. 1885. I was 41 years old, and I'd been alone on this ranch for 10 years. 10 long years since I buried my first wife, Margaret, and I'd made peace with the idea that I'd die alone too. He paused, watching his grandson's face, seeing the mixture of curiosity and respect that came when a boy realized his grandfather had lived a whole life before he was born. But then one summer day in June everything changed. A girl came running out of the heat like someone was chasing her from the far end of the world. She was wearing a wedding dress all torn up and covered in dust. And when she fell at my feet and grabbed my shirt with both hands, I knew my quiet days were over. The old rancher's eyes went distant, seeing not the spring day of 1900, but that scorching June afternoon 15 years past. The boy settled in to listen, and Wade Callahan began to tell the story that had shaped the second half of his life. The story of Clara Hayes. The story of the day everything changed. June 18, 1885. The sun hung in the Texas sky like a brass coin hot enough to make the air shimmer and dance. Inside the small white church at the edge of Redemption, the temperature had climbed past unbearable into something close to hellish. Clara Hayes stood in the cramped back room that served as the bride's preparation area, staring at her reflection in a mirror so old the silver had worn thin in places. The wedding dress was white, spotless, expensive. It should have made her feel beautiful. Instead, it felt like a burial shroud. Through the thin walls she could hear voices. The murmur of guests settling into pews, the rustling of programs. Someone coughed. A child whimpered until its mother shushed it quiet. And beneath it all, cutting through like a blade, she heard his voice. Silas Blackwood, her future husband, her uncle, her jailer. "Where is my bride?" His voice carried the educated smoothness of a man trained in Philadelphia, a doctor's voice that could soothe or command with equal ease. The ceremony should have started 10 minutes ago. Clara's hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the vanity. The face in the mirror looked like a stranger, 22 years old, but feeling ancient. Eyes that used to sparkle when her mother taught her to paint now held nothing but trapped fear. She thought of her brother Danny, 14 years old, and waiting outside with their father. Danny, who still had nightmares about the day their mother died. Danny, who needed food and shelter and a chance at life that their father could no longer provide. $8,000. That's what her father owed. A sum so massive, it might as well have been $8 million. Thomas Hayes had gambled on cattle that died in a hard winter. had borrowed from Silas Blackwood's bank when desperation clouded judgment, and now the debt had come due in the worst way possible. "Clara, honey." Her father's voice came through the door, soft and broken. "It's time." 3 months ago he'd sat her down at their kitchen table, the same table where her mother used to serve Sunday dinner. His hands had shaken as he explained. Silas would forgive the debt. Silas would let them keep their small ranch. Silas would provide for Danny's education, all for one simple thing: her. Clara closed her eyes and saw her mother's face. Rose Blackwood, who'd married Thomas Hayes against her own brother's wishes. Rose, who'd died 8 years ago from a fever that came on sudden and never let go. Rose, who'd whispered on her deathbed, "Don't ever let anyone take away your choices, Clara. Promise me." She'd promised. And now she was about to break that promise. The church bell began to toll. 5 minutes to the ceremony. 5 minutes until she walked down that aisle and became Mrs. Silas Blackwood. 5 minutes until she belonged to a man 30 years her senior. A man whose 3 previous wives had all died young, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Clara's breath came faster. The corset felt too tight. The dress felt too heavy. The room felt too small. Through the window she could see the cemetery behind the church where her mother lay buried beneath a simple stone marker, where Silas's 3 wives rested in expensive plots with elaborate monuments. 4 wives dead, and she would be number 5. The thought struck her like lightning. Not a maybe, not a possibility. A certainty that settled in her bones with the weight of truth. If she walked through that door she would die. Maybe not today, maybe not this year. But Silas Blackwood collected wives the way other men collected coins, and none of them survived long enough to grow old. Her mother's voice echoed in memory. "Don't ever let anyone take away your choices." The bell tolled again. 3 minutes. Clara looked at the window. It was small, barely large enough for a grown woman to fit through. It faced the back of the church, away from the gathered guests. Beyond it lay the cemetery, and beyond that, the open prairie that stretched for miles. 2 minutes. Her hands moved before her mind fully committed. She hiked up the heavy skirts of her wedding dress and climbed onto the vanity. The wood creaked beneath her weight. Her heart hammered so loud she was certain someone would hear it and burst through the door. 1 minute. She pushed the window open. The frame was swollen from summer heat and humidity, and it fought her every inch. A nail head, rusted and sharp, caught the fabric of her dress near the hem and tore a long gash. The sound of ripping cloth seemed impossibly loud. "Clara!" Her father's knock came at the door. "Clara, honey, they're waiting." She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. If she spoke, if she tried to explain, she would lose her nerve. And if she lost her nerve, she would walk down that aisle and seal her fate. The window came open. Hot air rushed in, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust and freedom. Clara squeezed through, scraping her shoulder on the frame, not caring. Her dress caught again and tore further. She landed hard in the dirt behind the church, stumbled, caught herself. For one perfect moment she froze. This was the point of no return. If she ran now, there would be consequences. Her father would lose everything. Danny would have nothing. Silas would come after her with all the resources and rage of a powerful man denied what he believed he owned. But if she stayed, she would die. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Clara ran. She ran through the cemetery, her white dress bright as a ghost against the weathered headstones. Past her mother's grave, past the elaborate monuments of Silas's dead wives. The symbolism wasn't lost on her even as panic drove her legs faster. She was running through death to find life. Behind her she heard shouting. The church door banged open. Silas's voice no longer smooth but sharp with fury. "Find her. She can't have gone far." The prairie opened before her like salvation. 2 miles to the nearest ranch. 2 miles with no cover, no shade, nothing but grass and heat and the pounding of her heart. Her wedding shoes, delicate things made for standing still and looking pretty, were never meant for running. Within 100 yards her feet blistered. Within 200 they bled. She kicked the shoes off and kept running. The sun beat down merciless and bright. Sweat soaked through her dress, making the heavy fabric cling and drag. Thorns from prairie grass caught at her skirts with every step. The torn section flapped and tangled around her legs. She grabbed it, ripped it further, shortened the dress to her knees. Modesty meant nothing. Survival meant everything. The sound of horses rose behind her. Not one horse, several. A hunting party. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps. Her vision swam with heat and exertion. She'd never run this far or this hard in her life. Ladies didn't run. Ladies walked sedately, spoke softly, obeyed without question. But Clara Hayes was done being a lady. A ranch house appeared in the distance like a mirage. Small, simple, but real. A barn, a corral, the glint of a windmill catching sunlight. And near the barn, a figure. A man working on something, his back to her approach. She tried to call out, but her throat was too dry. Tried to wave, but her arms felt like lead. The world tilted sideways. The ground rushed up to meet her. And then she was falling down into darkness that swallowed her whole. Wade Callahan was 41 years old, and he'd learned to appreciate silence. 10 years of living alone on 320 acres had taught him the language of wind and grass, the meaning of a hawk's cry, the subtle shift in light that meant weather changing. He'd made peace with solitude the way a man makes peace with any unchangeable truth. He was working on a saddle when the girl appeared. It was a California-style saddle with silver conchos, the kind that took patience to repair properly. The leather had cracked near the horn from too many hard years, and Wade was carefully working oil into the dry spots when movement at the edge of his vision made him look up. At first he thought he was seeing a ghost. A woman in white stumbling across the prairie dress, torn and filthy, moving with the desperation of prey running from a predator. The sun was bright behind her, turning her into a silhouette, something not quite real. Then she fell. Wade dropped the saddle and moved fast for a man who usually moved with deliberate calm. His boots kicked up dust as he ran. By the time he reached her, she'd collapsed completely, her face in the dirt, her chest heaving with each breath. He turned her over gently. She was young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and a face streaked with dust and tears. The dress she wore had once been fine, the kind of thing a woman wore for something special. Now it was ruined, ripped nearly to the knees, soaked with sweat, and stained with grass. A wedding dress, he realized. She was wearing a wedding dress. Her eyes fluttered open. Green eyes, he noticed. The color of new grass after spring rain. Those eyes found his face and locked on with an intensity that made something in his chest shift. "Please." Her voice came out as a rasp, barely above a whisper. "Please help me. They're coming." Wade didn't ask who, didn't waste time with questions she didn't have breath to answer. He scooped her up, feeling how light she was, how her whole body trembled like a bird that had flown too far. She grabbed his shirt with both hands, fingers digging into the fabric with desperate strength. "I couldn't do it," she gasped against his chest. "I couldn't marry him. I ran. I had to run." He carried her toward the house, his mind already working through possibilities and consequences. A runaway bride meant trouble, meant someone would come looking, meant his quiet life was about to get complicated in ways he hadn't invited. But he kept walking anyway. Inside the house it was cooler. Not much, but enough. He set her down in the chair by the kitchen table and moved to the water pump. His well went 40 feet deep, pulling water that stayed cold year-round. He filled a tin cup and brought it to her. "Slow," he said, the first word he'd spoken. "Drink slow, or you'll be sick." She obeyed, her hands shaking so badly that water slopped over the rim. When the cup was empty, he refilled it. She drank again, slower this time, and some of the panic left her eyes. Wade took the opportunity to really look at her. The wedding dress told one story. The fear in her eyes told another. The bleeding cuts on her feet told a third. He'd lived enough life to recognize when someone was running from something worse than inconvenience. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. "My feet. I lost my shoes." He fetched clean cloth and water from the basin. knelt in front of her gentle as he'd be with a wounded animal and cleaned the cuts. The soles of her feet were raw, blistered, bleeding. She must have run miles like this. While he worked, she watched him. He could feel the weight of her gaze assessing, trying to determine if she'd traded one danger for another. "What's your name?" Wade asked, wrapping her feet with strips of clean cotton. "Clara." A pause. "Clara Hayes." Hayes. The name struck a chord in his memory like a bell ringing in a distant room. Thomas Hayes. The man who'd saved his life 12 years ago when Wade was a deputy marshal chasing cattle rustlers and found himself ambushed and bleeding by a creek. He looked up at her face again, searching for the resemblance. She'd been just a child then, maybe 10 years old, hiding behind her father's legs, while Thomas Hayes carried a wounded stranger into his home and nursed him back to health. But the eyes were the same, the shape of her face, the stubborn set of her jaw. "Thomas Hayes is your father," Wade said. Not a question. Her eyes widened. "You know him? He saved my life once." Wade finished tying off the bandage and stood. "Long time ago. You were just a kid." Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something that might have been hope or might have been fear. "Then you know he's a good man." Wade heard what she didn't say. A good man who'd done something that forced his daughter to run away in her wedding dress. Before he could respond, the sound of horses reached them. Distant but getting closer, multiple riders moving fast. Clara's face went white. "They're coming for me." Wade moved to the window and looked out. Dust rose on the horizon. 5 riders, maybe 6, coming straight for his ranch. He should have felt alarm, should have calculated the odds, weighed his options, considered the wisdom of getting involved in someone else's trouble. But when he looked back at Clara Hayes, sitting in his kitchen with her ruined dress and bandaged feet and eyes full of terror, he felt something else entirely. He felt the same thing he'd felt 10 years ago when he'd held his dying wife Margaret and promised he'd never let anyone suffer if he had the power to prevent it. "You stay inside," Wade said, his voice calm and steady. "Don't come out till I say." He walked to the gun rack near the door and took down his Winchester Model 1873. 15 rounds loaded, 1 in the chamber. He'd kept it clean and ready out of habit more than necessity. A rancher's life was usually peaceful, but this was Texas in 1885, and peace was never guaranteed. Clara stood swaying slightly. "What are you going to do?" Wade checked the rifle's action smooth as silk. "Going to have a conversation. They'll hurt you. Silas has men who—" "Silas." The name landed heavy. "Silas Blackwood." She nodded, and Wade felt pieces clicking into place. Silas Blackwood owned the bank and redemption, owned half the town if rumors were true, had buried 3 wives in the cemetery behind the church, and apparently had been about to acquire a 4th. Wade looked at Clara standing in her torn wedding dress, this girl who'd run barefoot across 2 miles of prairie rather than marry a man old enough to be her father. Looked at her green eyes that held more courage than fear now that she'd found someone willing to stand between her and what chased her. "You stay inside," he repeated. Then he walked out into the Texas heat to meet whatever was coming. The riders arrived in a cloud of dust and attitude. 5 men on horseback dressed too neat for ranch work, carrying themselves with the swagger of people used to getting their way. Wade recognized the type. Hired muscle pretending to be respectable. The leader sat tall in his saddle, a man in his 40s with a face weathered by sun and hardened by whatever he'd done to earn Silas Blackwood's trust. Gordon Reeves, Wade recalled, foreman of Blackwood's holdings, a position that meant more than managing cattle. Next to Reeves rode Town Marshal Pete Donovan, looking uncomfortable in his official capacity. Pete was a decent enough man who'd taken a badge because someone had to, not because he had any taste for confrontation. The fact that he was here meant Silas had leverage on him. The other 3 were gunmen. Wade could tell by the way they wore their weapons positioned for quick draw rather than practical use. Men who made their living through intimidation and violence, dressed up in clean shirts to pretend otherwise. Wade stood between them and his house, the Winchester held loose in his right hand, barrel pointed at the ground. Casual, unthreatening, but ready. "Afternoon, Wade." Reeves spoke first, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a man conducting business he didn't particularly enjoy but would complete nonetheless. "We're looking for a runaway bride, young woman probably scared and confused. Thought she might have passed this way." Wade said nothing, just stood there, face expressionless, waiting. The silence stretched. Reeves shifted in his saddle. Marshal Donovan looked anywhere but at Wade's face. "Her name's Clara Hayes," Reeves continued. "Left her own wedding. Her father's worried sick. We just want to bring her home safe." "This is my land," Wade said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. Each word deliberate, each word a line being drawn. "Nobody passes through without my say." Reeves smiled, but it never touched his eyes. "Now, Wade, don't make this difficult. The girl's confused, probably suffering from wedding nerves. Her father wants her back, and Mr. Blackwood has been very patient about the whole situation." "How patient is a man when his bride runs away?" Wade asked. "Patient enough to send us to fetch her instead of coming himself." Reeves's hand drifted toward his gun belt in what he probably thought was a subtle gesture. "We don't want trouble, just want to collect what belongs to Mr. Blackwood and be on our way." "What belongs to him?" Wade repeated the phrase like he was tasting something bitter. "You make her sound like property." Marshal Donovan finally spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of a man trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "Wade, legally speaking, Clara Hayes is still under her father's authority. Thomas Hayes has given permission for Mr. Blackwood to collect her. We're here in an official capacity." "Official?" Wade's gaze settled on Donovan. "Pete, how much is Silas paying you to make this official?" The marshal's face flushed red. "That's not—" "I'm doing my duty." "Your duty." Wade nodded slowly. "Tell me something, Pete. Your duty include dragging a terrified woman back to a man she'd rather run barefoot across 2 miles of hell than marry." One of the gunmen, younger than the others, maybe 28 or so, shifted uneasily. Wade filed that away, a weak link in the chain. Reeves's false friendliness evaporated like morning dew. "Enough talk. We're searching the property. If she's here, we're taking her. You can cooperate or you can step aside, but one way or another we're doing our job." Wade's thumb moved to the hammer of his Winchester. Didn't cock it. Didn't need to. The gesture was clear enough. "Nobody searches anything on my land," he said. "This property belongs to me. My word is law here, and I say you boys need to turn those horses around and ride back the way you came." Reeves leaned forward in his saddle. "There's 5 of us, Wade. You might be good, but nobody's that good." Before Wade could respond, the front door of his house opened. Clara Hayes stepped out onto the porch, her chin up, her hands steady despite the trembling Wade could see in her shoulders. She'd found a blanket somewhere and wrapped it around her ruined dress, but there was no hiding what she was or where she'd run from. "I'm not going back," she said. Her voice carried across the yard clear and strong. "I'm not confused. I'm not suffering from nerves. I'm not going to marry Silas Blackwood." Marshal Donovan sat up straighter. "Miss Hayes, your father—" "My father made a choice," Clara interrupted. "A choice to pay his debts with his daughter. I'm making a different choice." "You don't have the right to choose," Reeves said flatly. "You're your father's daughter until you're wed. That's the law." "Then the law is wrong." Wade felt something shift in his chest. This girl, this young woman who'd run until her feet bled, standing up to 5 armed men with nothing but her voice and her conviction. There was steel in her spine that reminded him of Margaret, of the way his wife had faced down a cattle baron who'd thought he could intimidate a woman alone. "Miss Hayes." Marshal Donovan tried again, his voice gentler now. "You need to understand. Mr. Blackwood is your uncle, your mother's brother. He has legal standing as your next of kin. He's not just your fiancé, he's family." The revelation hit Wade like cold water. Silas Blackwood was Clara's uncle. The man wanted to marry his own niece. Clara's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "My mother left Silas Blackwood for a reason. She married my father against his wishes, and 8 years ago she died of a fever that came on sudden and never let go." She looked directly at Reeves, then at the marshal. Did either of you ask why Silas has buried 3 wives? Did you wonder why they all died young? Did you think for 1 second about what kind of man collects wives like other men collect coins? That's enough, Reeves snapped. You're coming with us. Now, either walk to a horse or be carried. Your choice. She's not going anywhere. Wade stepped forward, positioning himself between Clara and the riders. The movement was subtle, but its meaning was clear. To get to her, they'd have to go through him. The young gunman, the one who'd been shifting uneasily, spoke up for the first time. "Boss, that's Wade Callahan." Reeves glanced at him irritably. "I know who he is." The Wade Callahan, the one who took down all 3 Blackwell brothers by himself up on the Cheyenne Road. The other gunmen exchanged looks. Wade saw calculation replacing swagger. The Blackwell brothers had been bad men, fast with their guns and mean with their fists. The story of how a lone deputy marshal had faced all 3 and walked away while they didn't had spread through Texas like wildfire. It had been 12 years ago. Wade had been younger then, faster, maybe more willing to die for a principle. But the story had grown in the telling the way stories do until he'd become something close to a legend. Right now, he was grateful for every exaggeration. "I don't care if he's Wild Bill Hickok come back from the dead," Reeves said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We have a job to do." "Then do it," Wade said quietly. "Come on onto my property. Try to take that girl. See what happens." The standoff stretched like wire pulled tight. 5 men on horses weighing the odds, 1 man on foot with a rifle absolutely still, a young woman on a porch watching her fate being decided. The young gunman broke first. "I ain't dying on this ranch over somebody else's marriage problems." He pulled his horse's reins, backing away from the group. "Sorry, boss. I signed on for collection work, not gunfighting Wade Callahan." Another gunman followed, then the third muttering something about not getting paid enough. That left Reeves and Marshal Donovan. The marshal looked at Wade, then at Clara, then at the empty prairie that stretched in every direction. "This isn't over, Wade. Mr. Blackwood is a powerful man. He has resources, lawyers, influence." "Let him use them," Wade replied. "But he won't use them on my land, not today." Reeves's face had gone dark with fury. "You're making a mistake. When Mr. Blackwood hears about this, tell him Clara Hayes is under my protection. Tell him she stays here of her own free will, and tell him if he has a problem with that, he can come talk to me himself." For a moment, Wade thought Reeves might actually try it, might go for his gun and force the issue right here and now. But the man was a bully, not a fool. Without his backup, without the numerical advantage, he was just another middle-aged man with more pride than sense. "This isn't finished," Reeves said. He wheeled his horse around with more force than necessary, spurring it into a gallop. Dust rose behind him as he rode away, followed more slowly by Marshal Donovan. Wade stood watching until they disappeared into the shimmering heat, until even the sound of hoofbeats faded to nothing. Only then did he lower the Winchester and turn to face Clara. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, yes. Relief, certainly. But something else, too. Something that looked almost like wonder. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you stand up for me? You don't know me. You owe my father, not me." Wade thought about the question. Thought about Margaret, who died in his arms 10 years ago, whispering that she loved him even as fever burned her from the inside out. Thought about all the years since then living alone, convincing himself that being alone was the same as being at peace. "Your father stood up for me once when I was bleeding and had nowhere else to go," he said finally. "Figure I'm just returning the favor." But that wasn't the whole truth, and they both knew it. The whole truth was more complicated. The whole truth involved the way she'd looked at him with those green eyes, the courage it took to run barefoot across hell, the steel in her spine when she faced down 5 armed men. The whole truth was that for the first time in 10 years, Wade Callahan felt something other than empty. Clara descended from the porch, slowly favoring her bandaged feet. When she reached Wade, she stood close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose, could smell dust and fear, and something floral that must have been perfume from before her world fell apart. "They'll come back," she said softly. Silas won't let this go." "I know. He's a powerful man. He owns the bank. He owns half the town. He has money and influence and—" "I know," Wade repeated. "You could lose everything. Your ranch, your peace, maybe your life." Wade looked at her, really looked at her, saw past the ruined dress and the tear-streaked face to the woman underneath, saw strength and intelligence and a will to survive that matched his own. "Some things are worth fighting for," he said. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry, just nodded once, accepting his choice the way she'd accepted her own choice to run. They stood there in the late afternoon heat, two people who'd found each other by accident and necessity, while the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon and the first shadows of evening stretched across the prairie like reaching hands. Inside the house the future waited. Uncertain. Dangerous. But for the first time in a decade, Wade Callahan felt like he had a reason to face it. The old Wade paused in his telling, his weathered hand unconsciously touching the scar the boy had asked about. His grandson sat motionless, eyes wide. "So that's how Grandma Clara came into your life," the boy whispered. "That's how she ran into my life, yes. But the hardest part was still ahead." Wade's eyes grew distant. Because that night, everything changed again. He settled back in his chair, and his voice carried them back through time once more. The sun had set by the time Clara finally stopped shaking. Wade had given her his bedroom, the only room in the house with a proper bed, and taken the chair by the kitchen table for himself. He'd lived with less comfort during his years as a marshal. A hard chair was nothing, but sleep wouldn't come. He sat in the darkness, the Winchester across his lap, listening to the sounds of the prairie at night. Crickets singing their endless song. The windmill creaking as it turned. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called and another answered. And beneath it all, from the bedroom, the quiet sound of a woman crying. Wade had heard that sound before. 10 years ago, in the days after Margaret fell sick. The way she'd tried to muffle her tears in the pillow so he wouldn't hear, wouldn't know how frightened she was. He'd held her through those nights, helpless to do anything but be present, while fever consumed her from within. He stood and moved to the bedroom door. Knocked softly. "I'm fine." Clara's voice came through the wood, thick with tears she was trying to hide. "I'm sorry. I'll be quiet." "You don't need to be quiet," Wade said. "And you don't need to be sorry." Silence. Then the sound of the bed creaking as she sat up. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The woman in the photograph, on the wall, that was your wife?" Wade looked across the small room to where Margaret's picture hung in a simple wooden frame. She'd been 26 when that photograph was taken 2 years before the fever. Her smile had been genuine, her eyes full of life and plans for a future they'd never get to live. "That was Margaret," he said. "She was beautiful." "Yes." Another pause. "How did she die?" Wade should have expected the question, but it still hit him like a fist to the chest. "Fever. Came on sudden in the summer of 1875. 3 days later she was gone." He heard Clara take a shaky breath. "My mother died of fever too. 10 years ago in the summer of 75. Also sudden. Also too convenient." The coincidence settled between them, heavy with implication. 2 women, both dead of fever that came on sudden, both connected in different ways to Silas Blackwood. "Clara," Wade said slowly. "Your mother. Rose. What was her maiden name?" "Blackwood." Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "Rose Blackwood. She was Silas's younger sister." Wade's hand tightened on the doorframe. Pieces were falling into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. "Tell me about her." Through the door he heard Clara shift position. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Not crying anymore, but remembering. Telling a story she'd probably never told anyone. Mother was different from Silas. She was kind, gentle. She loved art and music and growing things. Silas loved order and control and money. They grew up in Philadelphia, old money family. Silas became a doctor, trained at the best schools. Mother was supposed to marry someone from a good family, someone Silas approved of. But she met your father instead. Yes. Father came to Philadelphia to sell cattle. He wasn't educated like Silas wanted, wasn't from the right family, wasn't part of their world. But Mother loved him, so she ran away with him, came to Texas. Silas never forgave her. Wade could picture it. A young woman choosing love over obligation, leaving behind wealth and comfort for an uncertain future with a man her brother despised. It took courage to make that choice, the same kind of courage it took to run from a wedding in a torn dress. After they married, did Silas try to contact her? Once. He came to Texas about a year after I was born, stayed for a week. I don't remember it, but Mother told me about it later. Said Silas wanted her to come home, said Father wasn't good enough for Blackwood blood. Mother refused. Silas left angry. And then, nothing for years. Then 8 years ago, Silas moved to Redemption, opened a bank, became important, started visiting our ranch sometimes. Mother was always nervous when he came, made Father promise never to leave her alone with Silas. Clara's voice dropped even lower. 2 weeks after Silas's last visit, Mother got sick. Fever, like you said. Came on sudden. Silas was her doctor. He brought medicine. She got worse instead of better. And then she died. Wade felt cold, despite the summer heat. Did anyone question it? Who would question a doctor trying to save his own sister? Everyone said it was tragic. Said Silas must be devastated. He paid for an expensive funeral, put up a beautiful headstone, cried at the burial. But you didn't believe it. I was 14. What did I know? But Mother said something before she died. She was delirious with fever, hardly making sense. But she grabbed my hand and said, "Don't let Silas near you. Promise me. Don't ever let him near you." The bedroom door opened. Clara stood in the frame, wrapped in a quilt Wade's grandmother had sewn 40 years ago. Her eyes were red from crying, but they were also fierce with something that looked like clarity. "I think Silas killed my mother," she said. "I think he's killed all his wives, and I think if I'd married him, I would have been next." Wade looked at this young woman who'd connected dots that should have been connected years ago, who'd trusted her instinct enough to run when every force in her world told her to stay. "I think you're right," he said. Before either of them could say more, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the night. Not the measured pace of a lone rider, the desperate gallop of someone running hard. Wade grabbed his Winchester and moved to the window. Clara followed, staying just behind his shoulder. Through the darkness they could see a single horse approaching its rider, small and hunched forward. "That's Danny," Clara breathed. "That's my brother." She was out the door before Wade could stop her, running barefoot across the yard, despite her bandaged feet. The rider pulled the horse to a stumbling stop and nearly fell from the saddle. Clara caught him, and in the moonlight Wade saw it was indeed a boy, maybe 14 years old, exhausted and terrified. Wade brought the rifle and his caution with him as he approached. The boy looked up at him with wide eyes, taking in the gun, the stranger, the situation his sister had landed in. "Danny," Clara was saying, her hands on his shoulders. "What happened? Why are you here?" The boy's breath came in gasps. "Father. They came for Father, Silas's men. They were asking where you went. Father wouldn't tell them, said he didn't know. They didn't believe him." Clara's face went white. "What did they do?" "They beat him. Bad. I tried to stop them, but—" Danny's voice broke. "I'm sorry, Clara. I tried." Wade stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "Son, is your father still alive?" Danny nodded, tears streaming down his face. "He told me to run, to find Clara, to warn her that Silas is coming here, tonight, with more men. He's not just going to ask any more." "How many men?" Wade asked. "I don't know. 10, maybe more. They were gathering when I left." Wade looked toward the horizon, calculating. An hour's ride from town, maybe less if they pushed hard. That gave them time, but not much. "Clara, get the boy inside. Get him water." Wade's mind was already moving, planning, preparing. "Danny, you know how to shoot." The boy wiped his face with the back of his hand. Slingshot. I'm pretty good with a slingshot. Ever held a real gun? Danny shook his head, trying to look braver than he was. No, sir, but I can learn. Wade studied the boy. 14 years old, skinny, still more child than man, but he'd ridden 5 miles in the dark to warn his sister. He'd tried to protect his father against grown men with fists and guns. There was steel in this kid buried under the fear. Come with me, Wade said. Inside the house he went to the gun rack and took down his old Winchester Model 1866. It was lighter than the 1873, easier for a boy to handle. He checked the action, made sure it was clean, loaded it with 12 rounds. This is a rifle, Wade said, stating the obvious in a way that made it significant. It's not a toy. It's not for showing off. It's a tool, and like any tool you need to know how to use it before you can be trusted with it. Danny nodded, his eyes locked on the weapon. Wade handed him the rifle. Feel the weight. Get comfortable with it. The boy took it awkwardly, holding it like it might explode. Wade adjusted his grip, positioned his hands properly, showed him how to tuck it against his shoulder. Shooting is about 3 things, Wade said. Breath control, sight alignment, and trigger squeeze. Nothing else matters. Not how strong you are, not how fast you are. Just those 3 things. For the next 30 minutes by lamplight in the small house, Wade taught Danny Hayes how to become dangerous. Not with fancy tricks or quick-draw nonsense, but with the solid fundamentals that kept a man alive when the shooting started. Clara watched from the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. Wade was aware of her presence, aware of how she studied him with those green eyes, trying to understand what kind of man would take the time to teach a terrified boy when armed men were riding toward them through the darkness. "Why are you doing this?" Danny asked at one point, echoing his sister's earlier question. "Why are you helping us? We brought trouble to your door." Wade adjusted the boy's stance, making sure his feet were planted right. Trouble finds a man whether he wants it or not. Question isn't whether trouble comes. Question is what you do when it arrives. He stepped back, gestured toward the empty bean cans he'd set up on the fence outside. "Show me what you learned." Danny raised the rifle, hands trembling slightly. Took a breath, let it out slow, squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide by 3 feet. "Again," Wade said. Danny shot again. Missed again. Again. By the 5th shot, Danny was starting to control his breathing. By the 10th, his hands had steadied. On the 12th shot, the bean can jumped and spun, hit dead center. The boy's face lit up with surprised pride. "I did it." "You did it," Wade confirmed. "Now do it in the dark with men shooting back and we'll be impressed." The honesty cut through Danny's excitement, brought him back to reality. But it didn't crush him. Instead, Wade saw something settle in the boy's eyes. Understanding, acceptance of what was coming. "Mr. Callahan," Danny said seriously, "will you teach me more, Key?" "Wade. Just Wade." He collected the rifle, began reloading it. "And yes, I'll teach you more. But first we need to prepare. Because those men your father warned us about, they'll be here soon." Clara stood from the table. "What do we do?" Wade looked at her, then at Danny, then at the small house that had been his sanctuary for 10 years. Time to turn sanctuary into fortress. "We get ready for war," he said. The next hour passed in focused preparation. Wade worked with the efficiency of a man who'd defended positions before, who understood the difference between cover and concealment, who knew that survival often came down to preparation more than skill. He spread a piece of paper on the kitchen table and sketched the layout of his ranch. Clara and Danny gathered around, watching as he marked critical points with quick strokes of pencil. "Main house here," Wade tapped the drawing. 2 rooms, wooden walls 4 inches thick. Oak, not pine. Will stop most pistol rounds, slow down rifle rounds. Not perfect, but better than nothing. He drew the barn. 40 feet away. Vulnerable to fire. They'll try to burn it first, draw us out, or just destroy our resources. "The well is between the house and the barn," Clara observed, studying the map. "Right. Which means if the barn burns, we still have water, but we'll need it inside before the shooting starts." Wade looked at Danny. "Think you can carry water buckets?" Yes, sir. Wade, I mean. Good. We'll need 6 barrels filled, 40 gallons each, for drinking and for fighting fire if they try to burn us out. For the next 30 minutes, Danny hauled water while Wade and Clara fortified the house. They moved Wade's supply of feed sacks inside, stacking them against the windows. 100-pound sacks of grain that would stop bullets as effectively as sandbags. Wade showed Clara the weapons. The Winchester 1873 with 15 rounds. The old 1866 model for Danny with 12. His Colt single-action Army revolver. 45 caliber 6 shots. And finally, a double-barrel shotgun he'd kept since his Marshall days. "Ever fired a gun?" he asked Clara. She shook her head. "Father wouldn't let me. Said it wasn't ladylike." Wade handed her the shotgun. "This is the most forgiving weapon we have. Point in the general direction, pull the trigger, let the spread do the work. You don't need to be precise, you just need to be willing." Clara took the weapon, felt its weight. "If someone comes through that door trying to hurt Danny, I'll be willing." "I believe you." Wade showed her how to load it, how to break it open, how to check if it was ready. 8 shells. When you're empty, you reload. Like this. He demonstrated his hands moving with practiced ease. Clara copied his movements slower but learning fast. By the time Danny finished hauling the 6th barrel of water, she could load and unload the shotgun without fumbling. "Tell me about Silas," Wade said while they worked. "Not his business. Not his position. Tell me about the man." Clara set down the shotgun and thought for a moment. "He's intelligent, educated, always dressed perfectly, always in control. People in town respect him because he's wealthy and because he's a doctor. He's saved lives. But he's also," she struggled for the right word, "obsessed. With bloodlines. With purity. With the Blackwood name. He used to tell Mother that she'd diluted the family blood by marrying Father, said she'd made a mistake that needed to be corrected." Danny spoke up from where he was stacking the last water barrel. "He came to the house 2 months ago. Told Father the debt was due. Father said he didn't have the money. Silas said there was another way. Said Clara could marry him, join the families back together, purify the bloodline." Wade felt disgust curl in his stomach. "Your father agreed." "Father said no at first." Clara's voice was quiet. "But Silas showed him the terms of the loan. Said if the debt wasn't paid, he'd take our ranch. Everything. We'd have nothing. Danny would have nothing. And then Silas said if Clara married him, not only would the debt be forgiven, but he'd provide for Danny's education, send him to school back east, give him opportunities. Father only agreed because of me," Danny said, guilt thick in his voice. "If it wasn't for me, Clara wouldn't have had to—" "Stop." Clara crossed to her brother, put her hands on his shoulders. "This isn't your fault. Father made his choice. Silas manipulated him, and I made my choice to run. None of this is on you." Wade watched the siblings, saw the love between them, the loyalty, saw what Silas Blackwood had tried to use as leverage, what he'd tried to twist into control. "Clara," Wade said carefully, "there's something you need to know about your mother." She turned to face him, wariness in her eyes. Wade went to the wall where Margaret's photograph hung. His fingers traced the edge of the frame. "Look at this picture. Really look at it." Clara approached, studied the photograph. Wade watched her eyes move across the image, taking in Margaret's face, her dress the background of the photo studio, and then freezing on something at the edge of the frame. "There's someone else there," Clara whispered. "A woman, standing just at the edge. The photo is faded, but—" "That's Rose Blackwood," Wade said quietly. "Your mother." Clara's head snapped toward him. "What? How, when was this taken?" "June of 1875. Margaret went to town for shopping, ran into Rose. They got their photograph taken together. Rose died 2 weeks later. Margaret died that same summer in August. When I finally looked at the photograph months later, I saw Rose there at the edge, and it all started to make sense. 2 women both dead within 2 months, both after being in contact with Silas." He paused, remembering. "I asked around town. Found out Margaret had run into Rose that day. They'd talked, gone to the photographer together. The photographer said they seemed like old friends, though he'd never seen them together before. "Mother never mentioned knowing your wife," Clara said. "No, and I didn't think much of it at the time. Margaret knew lots of people. But about 3 years ago I was going through Margaret's things, found a letter tucked in her Bible, from Rose. Wade had memorized that letter, had read it so many times the paper had worn thin. Rose wrote to Margaret 2 days before she died, said she knew she was sick, knew she wouldn't survive, and she asked Margaret to do something. She asked her to protect her daughter if anything ever happened." Clara's face had gone pale. "Protect me from what?" "From Silas. Rose wrote that she'd made a mistake marrying Thomas, not because she didn't love him, but because it had put her children in danger. She said Silas was obsessed with keeping the Blackwood bloodline pure, that he believed she'd contaminated it with Hayes' blood, and that he would try to correct that mistake through her children. He wants Clara because she's half Blackwood," Danny said, understanding dawning. "He wants to marry her to bring the bloodline back to pure." Wade nodded. "That's my guess. It's not about love. It's not even about control. It's about his twisted idea of genetic purity. He sees Clara as the way to fix what he sees as your mother's mistake." Clara sank into a chair, her face in her hands. "So Mother knew. She knew Silas was dangerous. She knew he'd come for me someday. She tried to warn Margaret, tried to set up protection for you, but then Margaret died too. Same fever, same suddenness, same summer." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Clara looked up, her eyes wide with horror. "You think Silas killed your wife too, but why? She wasn't related to him. She wasn't part of his plans. She was a witness. She knew about Rose's fears. She had that letter. If I'd put the pieces together back then, if I'd realized what Rose was warning about—" Wade's voice hardened. "Silas couldn't let that risk exist." Danny had gone very still. "How does he do it? How does a doctor kill people without anyone knowing? Poison, most likely. Something slow-acting that mimics natural illness. Arsenic, maybe. Small doses mixed with legitimate medicine. By the time anyone realizes something's wrong, it's too late to prove anything." Wade looked at Clara. "Your mother was smart to hide evidence, smart to leave that warning. But where?" Clara stood pacing the small room. "Where would she hide evidence? Our house has been searched a dozen times. Silas has been through it. If there was something there, he would have found it." "Maybe not," Danny said slowly. "Remember Mother's room? The floorboard by the window that always creaked. She told us never to step on it, said it was loose and dangerous." Clara stopped pacing. "The loose floorboard." Brother and sister stared at each other, the same thought crystallizing in both their minds. Evidence. Proof. Hidden where only someone who knew to look would find it. Before they could discuss it further, the sound of horses reached them again, but this time it wasn't a single desperate rider. This was the rumble of many hooves, many men, moving with purpose and anger. Wade moved to the window and looked out into the darkness. Torches bobbed in the distance, approaching in a line. He counted quickly. 10 riders, maybe more behind them. "They're here," he said. Danny grabbed his rifle with shaking hands. Clara picked up the shotgun. Wade checked his Winchester one final time, made sure his Colt was loaded and ready. "Remember what I taught you," he said to Danny. "Breathe, aim, squeeze." "What about me?" Clara asked. Wade looked at her standing there in a borrowed shirt and pants, holding a shotgun like she'd been born to it. "You protect your brother, you protect yourself, and you don't hesitate. Hesitation gets you killed." The riders were close now, close enough to make out faces in the torchlight. Wade's jaw tightened. Leading the group was a carriage, and sitting in that carriage with the posture of a king surveying his domain was Silas Blackwood. Wade had seen the man before, of course. Everyone in Redemption knew Silas, but he'd never really looked at him, never studied him the way he did now. Silas was in his 50s, tall, well-dressed even at midnight, with silver hair and a face that would have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. Behind the carriage rode Gordon Reeves and 9 other men, all armed, all ready for violence. The carriage stopped 30 yards from the house. Silas stepped down with the careful movements of a man who never rushed, never showed uncertainty. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Wade's entire ranch. His medical bag sat on the carriage seat behind him. Always the doctor, always the healer, the perfect disguise for a killer. Wade Callahan. Silas's voice carried across the distance, smooth and educated and utterly controlled. I had hoped we could settle this matter civilly. Wade stepped out onto the porch, Winchester held ready. Then you should have stayed away from my land. Your land. Silas smiled, but it was the smile of a snake measuring a mouse. I respect property rights, Mr. Callahan. I truly do. But you're harboring property that belongs to me. Clara Hayes is not property. She's a human being with the right to choose her own path. Clara Hayes is confused and frightened. She ran from her wedding due to temporary hysteria, a medical condition I'm quite qualified to treat. Silas gestured to his bag. I'm here as her physician and her uncle to bring her home safely. Is that what you told yourself when you killed your 3 wives? Wade asked. That you were treating them. Silas's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise that Wade knew. Calculation of how much he knew. Assessment of whether it mattered. My wives died of natural causes. Tragic, yes. But natural. I tried to save them, Mr. Callahan. As a doctor, I tried everything in my power. Your power. That's what this is about, isn't it? Power and control and your twisted idea of bloodline purity. Now Silas's smile did fade. You don't understand. You can't understand. The Blackwood line goes back 200 years. Pure. Untainted. My sister threatened that with her marriage to a common rancher. I forgave that mistake because I loved her, but I won't make the same mistake twice. You killed Rose. Clara's voice rang out from the doorway. You poisoned your own sister. Silas turned his attention to her, and his face softened in a way that was somehow worse than his cold smile. No, my dear. I tried to save her. I tried to cure her of the illness she'd brought on herself through her poor choices, but she refused my help, refused my medicine, and so she died, leaving you and your brother to suffer the consequences of her rebellion. That's a lie. Clara stepped fully onto the porch beside Wade. Mother didn't refuse your help. She was afraid of you. She knew what you were. She was delirious with fever, making wild accusations that had no basis in reality. Silas spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. Just as you're making wild accusations now. Can't you see, Clara? The Hayes blood has made you unstable, irrational. You need proper care, proper guidance, proper medicine to cure you of this hysteria. Wade felt Clara tense beside him, heard her sharp intake of breath. The threat was clear. Silas would declare her insane, lock her away in an asylum, drug her into compliance. And as a doctor with money and influence, he had the power to do it. Over my dead body, Wade said quietly. That can be arranged. Silas's voice hardened. Mr. Callahan, I've been patient. I've tried to be reasonable, but my patience has limits. Give me Clara, and you and the boy can walk away. Refuse, and I'll take her anyway. The only question is, how many people die in the process? You're forgetting something. Wade's finger moved to the trigger of his Winchester. You're on my land. You brought armed men onto my property with intent to do harm. In Texas, that gives me the legal right to defend what's mine. Marshal Donovan would disagree. Marshal Donovan isn't here. Wade had noticed the absence. The town marshal had backed down either out of conscience or cowardice. Either way, Silas had lost his cover of legal authority. True. Silas stepped back toward his carriage. Which means what happens next is entirely your responsibility, Mr. Callahan. History will record that you forced my hand. He climbed into the carriage and gestured to Reeves. The foreman raised his hand, and the men behind him spread out in a line surrounding the house on 3 sides. Last chance, Silas called. Give me what's mine or lose everything you've built here. Wade's answer was to raise his Winchester and fire a single shot. Not at any person, just into the air. A declaration, a line in the sand. You have my answer, he said. For a moment everything froze. 10 men with guns, 1 man, 1 woman, and 1 boy facing them down. The torches flickered in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance an owl called. Then Gordon Reeves threw his torch toward the barn. The world exploded into chaos and flame. The torch spun through the air like a falling star trailing sparks in its wake. Wade tracked its arc with his eyes, already knowing where it would land, already calculating the damage it would do. The barn. Dry wood and hay and 10 years of accumulated memories about to go up in flames. He fired before the torch hit the roof. The shot was perfect, born of decades handling a rifle. The torch exploded in mid-air wood and burning pitch, scattering harmlessly across the dirt yard. Gordon Reeves stared at the impossible shot, his confidence wavering for just a moment. Then he recovered, yanking another torch from the rider beside him. "Burn it all!" he shouted. The night erupted in gunfire. Wade dropped behind the feed sack stacked against the window frame. Bullets slammed into the thick burlap, some punching through but losing enough momentum that they couldn't penetrate the wooden wall behind. The house filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the deafening percussion of firearms in enclosed space. "Danny, back window," Wade shouted over the chaos. "Anyone comes within 50 feet, you tell me." The boy scrambled to position the Winchester 1866 clutched in white-knuckled hands. Wade saw terror in Danny's eyes, but also determination. The kid was holding it together. Clara crouched beside Wade, the shotgun braced against her shoulder the way he'd shown her. Her face was pale but set. When a gunman rushed the front porch trying to use the confusion to get close, she didn't hesitate. The shotgun roared, and the man went down screaming, peppered with buckshot in his legs. Not a killing shot, but enough to take him out of the fight. Wade worked the Winchester's lever action with practiced efficiency, aimed, fired. A gunman who'd been trying to circle around to the side grabbed his shoulder and fell back. Another aimed shot. Another man down. Wade wasn't trying to kill anyone, just removing pieces from the board, making Silas's hired muscle reconsider their life choices. The problem was that there were too many of them. For every man Wade put down, 2 more kept firing, kept advancing, kept the pressure on. A torch sailed over the house and landed in the dirt on the far side. Then another, and another. They were trying to surround them with fire, smoke them out like rabbits from a hole. "Clara, we need to stop those fires before they catch." Wade reloaded quickly, fingers moving on muscle memory alone. "Danny, watch that back door." But before Clara could move, the back door exploded inward. A gunman had circled around, kicked it open, was raising his pistol toward Danny's back. Wade spun, bringing the Winchester around, but he was too far away. The angle was wrong. He wasn't going to make it in time. "Did you die, Grandpa?" The boy's voice cracked with worry, even though the old man sat alive before him. Wade smiled a sad, knowing smile. "Not that night, but a part of me did in a way. The part that thought I could protect everyone just by being strong." He took a slow breath. "Let me tell you what happened next." Clara was faster. She'd turned at the sound of splintering wood, seen the threat to her brother. The shotgun came up and boomed, catching the intruder full in the chest at point-blank range. The man flew backward through the open door and didn't move again. Danny stood frozen, staring at his sister. Clara was breathing hard, her hands shaking now that the immediate threat had passed. She'd just killed a man. The reality of it was written across her face. "Clara," Wade said, his voice cutting through her shock, "you saved your brother's life. Remember that. Only that." She nodded shakily and turned away from the body, focusing on the fires outside instead. Wade saw her jaw set, saw her push the horror down deep where it couldn't paralyze her. She was stronger than she knew. The gunfire slackened. Wade risked a look through the window and saw Silas's remaining men pulling back, regrouping. 3 were down from Wade's shooting. 1 was dead from Clara's shotgun. The rest were reconsidering the wisdom of rushing a fortified position defended by someone who could shoot torches out of the air. In the brief lull, Wade heard voices arguing outside. "I ain't dying for this," one of the younger gunmen, voice high with fear. "You didn't say nothing about fighting Wade Callahan." "You'll do what you're paid to do," Reeves snarled back. "Not for any amount of money. That man just shot a torch out of the air while it was moving. You know what kind of skill that takes, and the girl killed Davis without blinking. I'm out." The sound of a horse being spurred away, then another. Men fleeing into the darkness, abandoning Silas's crusade. Wade allowed himself a grim smile. Fear was contagious. Once it started, it spread fast. But his satisfaction died when he saw movement at the edge of the torchlight. A rider he recognized. Young, maybe 28. The one who'd backed down earlier today when faced with Wade's reputation. Cole Turner. And he was riding straight toward the house with his hands up, his gun still holstered. "Hold fire," Wade called to Clara and Danny. "I want to see what this is about." Turner pulled his horse to a stop 20 yards out, close enough to talk, far enough to retreat if this was a trick. "Mr. Callahan," he called, "I need to talk. It's important. Talk fast." Wade kept the Winchester trained on him. "My name is Cole Turner. I'm not what I seem. I'm a Pinkerton detective, and I've been investigating Silas Blackwood for the last 6 months. Wade's finger stayed on the trigger, but his mind raced. A Pinkerton man, working undercover. If it was true, it changed everything. "Prove it," he shouted back. Turner slowly reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet, held it up. Even at this distance, Wade could see the glint of a badge. "I have evidence," Turner continued. "Documentation of 3 suspicious deaths connected to Blackwood, financial records, witness statements, but I need Clara Hayes alive to testify. If she dies tonight, Blackwood walks free. No matter what evidence I have, without a witness, it won't stand up in court." Behind the remaining gunmen, Wade saw Silas step down from his carriage. Even from here, Wade could see the fury in the man's posture. His carefully constructed plan was falling apart, and men like Silas didn't handle loss of control well. "Reeves," Silas's voice cut through the night. "Bring me that girl, now. I don't care what you have to do." But Reeves didn't move. The foreman looked at his remaining men, looked at the house where Wade Callahan had already demonstrated impossible skill, looked at the bodies of men who'd thought they could rush a defended position. "Mr. Blackwood," Reeves said carefully, "maybe we should reconsider. Fall back and try legal channels. You own half the judges in the territory. I gave you an order, and I'm telling you it's suicide. That man in there is Wade Callahan, the real deal, not a story, not a legend. The actual man who took down the Blackwell brothers, and he's protecting that girl like she's his own blood. We push this, we all die." Silas's face contorted with rage. In that moment, his mask of civilization slipped completely, and Wade saw what lay beneath. Not a doctor, not a businessman, a fanatic who'd convinced himself that his obsession was righteousness. "You're all cowards," Silas screamed. He reached into his medical bag and pulled out not medicine, but a small derringer. The weapon looked almost toy-like in his hand, but at close range it would kill as surely as any gun. He advanced toward the house alone, rage overwhelming caution. "If you want something done," he shouted, "do it yourself." Wade had a clear shot, could have ended it right there, but something stayed his hand. Maybe it was the pathetic sight of a man so consumed by his delusions that he'd throw his life away. Maybe it was the knowledge that killing Silas here now would make the man a martyr and Clara a murderer in the eyes of the law. Or maybe it was Cole Turner's voice, urgent and desperate. "Don't shoot him, Callahan. We need him alive. Alive, he can be prosecuted. Dead, he becomes a victim, and Clara becomes a fugitive." Wade lowered the Winchester slightly. Not enough to be defenseless, just enough to show restraint. Silas was 15 yards from the house when he stopped. Seemed to realize finally that his rage had carried him into a position where he was surrounded by people who wanted him dead or imprisoned. His gun hand wavered. "Clara," he called out. "Clara, please, come out and talk to me. I'm your uncle. I'm your family. Your mother would want you to listen to family." "My mother feared you." Clara stepped into the doorway. Wade's protests ignored. She was done hiding, done running. She knew what you were, what you did, and she tried to warn people, but no one would listen. Your mother was sick, delusional. The fever took her mind before it took her life. The fever you gave her." Clara's voice rose, years of suppressed grief and rage pouring out. "The poison you mixed into her medicine. The slow death you gave her because she dared to marry someone you didn't approve of." Silas's composure cracked further. "I tried to save her. She refused my help. You are the help she needed saving from." The words hung in the air. Silas stood there in his expensive suit, his derringer still raised his face, a mask of anguish that might have been genuine or might have been the final performance of a skilled liar. "I loved your mother," he said quietly. "Everything I've done has been to honor her memory, to correct the mistake she made, to purify what she contaminated." "She didn't make a mistake," Clara said. "She made a choice, and that choice was to be free of you." Something in Silas broke. Wade saw it happen, saw the moment when the man's elaborate justifications collapsed under the weight of truth he'd spent years denying. The derringer fell from his hand, landing in the dust. "I never meant—" Silas's voice was barely audible. "I only wanted—" He sagged suddenly, looking every one of his 54 years. Looked at Clara with eyes that held genuine confusion, as if he truly couldn't understand how his noble intentions had led to this moment. "I would have loved you," he whispered. "I would have given you everything. The Blackwood name, the Blackwood legacy, everything your mother threw away." "I don't want your legacy," Clara said. "I want freedom. I want choice. I want to live my life on my terms, not yours." Cole Turner moved forward cautiously, pulling handcuffs from his belt. The remaining gunman didn't interfere. Reeves actually looked relieved that the standoff was ending without more bloodshed. "Silas Blackwood," Turner said formally, "you're under arrest for suspicion of murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent, though anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Silas didn't resist as the cuffs clicked around his wrists, just stood there staring at Clara with an expression that mixed longing and incomprehension. "You look so much like her," he said softly. "So much like Rose. I thought if I could just bring you back into the family it would be like having her back, like fixing everything that went wrong." "I'm not her," Clara said. "I'm me, and I choose freedom." Turner led Silas toward his horse. The man who'd arrived with such confidence and power left in handcuffs, defeated not by violence, but by the simple refusal of a young woman to be owned. As they prepared to leave, Turner paused and looked back at Wade. "I need Clara to testify. There's a federal marshal coming from Austin in 3 days. Can you keep her safe until then?" Wade looked at Clara, then at Danny, still clutching his rifle, then at the bodies in his yard and the scorch marks where torches had fallen. His quiet life was thoroughly destroyed. The peaceful solitude he'd built was shattered beyond repair. "Yes," he said, "I can keep her safe." Turner nodded. 3 days. Then we end this properly. With law. With justice. The way it should be done. He rode away, leading Silas's horse behind him. Reeves and the remaining gunmen followed, eager to distance themselves from the night's failure. Within minutes the ranch was quiet again, except for the sound of wind through grass and the creak of the windmill. Clara sagged against the doorframe, exhaustion finally catching up with adrenaline. Danny set down his rifle with shaking hands and went to his sister. Wade watched them embrace 2 orphans who'd survived against odds that should have crushed them. "Is it over?" Danny asked quietly. "Not yet," Wade replied, "but we're closer than we were." He looked at the eastern horizon where dawn was just beginning to paint the sky with faint light. They'd made it through the night. Now they just had to make it 3 more days. 3 days to gather evidence. 3 days to prepare testimony. 3 days until a federal marshal arrived and the machinery of law could finally grind Silas Blackwood into the justice he'd evaded for so long. Wade allowed himself to hope just a little that maybe they could actually win this. The next morning, Danny insisted on going back to check on their father. Wade tried to argue against it, tried to explain that it might be a trap, that Silas's men might still be watching the Hayes homestead. But the boy was adamant, and Wade understood. A son needed to see his father, needed to know for certain whether Thomas Hayes had survived the beating. "I'll go with you," Wade said finally. They rode out at dawn, leaving Clara at the ranch with the shotgun and strict instructions to shoot first and ask questions later if anyone approached. The ride to the Hayes place took 30 minutes across terrain that grew progressively more neglected. Thomas Hayes had been a good rancher once, but the debt had broken him, turned his land into a shadow of what it could be. The house was small, smaller than Wade's, with a sagging porch and windows that needed replacing. Danny dismounted before the horse had fully stopped running inside, with fear and hope warring on his young face. Wade followed more slowly, the Winchester ready but not raised. The house was quiet, too quiet. Inside they found Thomas Hayes lying on his bed, pale as death but breathing. His face was a mass of bruises, his ribs clearly broken from the way he held himself. But he was alive. "Danny?" Thomas's voice was weak but clear. "You came back. I had to see you, Father. Had to make sure." Danny's voice broke. "I'm alive. Hurts like hell, but I'm alive." Thomas's eyes shifted to Wade standing in the doorway. Recognition flickered across his face. Wade Callahan. Been a long time. "Thomas." Wade moved closer. "You need a doctor." "Not Silas." A weak attempt at humor that came out as a pained grimace. "No, not Silas. But you need medical attention. Those ribs are broken, maybe worse." Thomas shook his head slightly. "Can't afford a doctor. Can't afford much of anything anymore. That's how this whole mess started." Wade knelt beside the bed, studying the man who'd once carried him 3 miles with a bullet in his leg. Thomas Hayes had been strong then, capable, full of plans for the future. Now he was broken not just in body, but in spirit. "You made a choice," Wade said quietly. "A hard choice. Wrong choice. But I understand why you made it." "I sold my daughter." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "Thought I was saving my son, saving our future. But I was just trading one child's life for another's comfort. What kind of father does that? A desperate one. A scared one. A human one." "Is Clara safe? Please tell me she's safe." "She's safe. At my ranch. Protected." Thomas closed his eyes, relief washing over his features. "Thank you. I don't deserve your help, but thank you. You saved my life once. Now we're even." But they both knew it wasn't about evening scores. It was about something deeper, about men trying to do right in a world that made right choices hard to find. Danny spent the next hour caring for his father, bringing water, adjusting pillows, trying to make him comfortable. Wade used the time to search the house, looking for what Clara had mentioned. The loose floorboard in Rose's old room. He found it by the window exactly where Danny had described. The board creaked when he stepped on it, shifted when he pressed down. Wade pulled out his knife and carefully pried it up. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a small wooden box. Inside the box, a diary bound in faded leather and a small glass vial containing white residue. Wade's hands trembled slightly as he opened the diary. Rose Blackwood's handwriting filled the page's elegant script that grew increasingly shaky as the entries progressed. April 3, 1875, Silas visited today. Brought me medicine for my headaches. Thomas doesn't trust him, but I took it to keep peace in the family. Perhaps I'm being paranoid. Perhaps Silas truly wants to help. May 12, 1875. The medicine isn't helping. I feel weaker. My hands shake. Clara asks why I can't hold my teacup steady anymore. I don't know what to tell her. June 8, 1875. I know now. God help me, I know. I saw Silas smile when I dropped my spoon at dinner, saw satisfaction in his eyes when I stumbled on the stairs. He's not trying to cure me, he's poisoning me. Slowly, carefully, making it look like natural illness. June 14, 1875. I saved a dose of the medicine, scraped the residue into this vial. If I die, this is proof. But who will believe it? Silas is respected, a doctor, a pillar of the community. and I'm just a woman who married against her brother's wishes." The final entry was dated June 15, 1875, 2 days before Rose died. "Tomorrow I will try to warn Margaret Callahan. She's the only one I can trust. Wade Callahan was a marshal once. He knows about justice. If anything happens to me, Margaret will tell him. Will protect my Clara. I've written her a letter explaining everything. Please God, let it be enough. Let my death not be in vain. Let Clara live free of Silas's madness." Wade closed the diary carefully. This was it. Evidence. Proof. The kind of documentation that could bring down even a man as powerful as Silas Blackwood. He returned to the main room where Danny was still tending to his father. "I found it," Wade said, showing them the diary and vial. Thomas looked at the items with recognition and sorrow. "Rose told me she'd hidden something. After she died, I looked but never found it. Thought maybe she'd been delirious after all." He paused. "Will it be enough?" "It'll have to be. Combined with Cole Turner's investigation and Clara's testimony, it should be enough to convict. If he doesn't buy off the judge, if he doesn't intimidate the jury, if he doesn't use his influence to make it all disappear." Thomas's voice was bitter with experience. "Men like Silas don't go down easy." "Maybe not, but they do go down, eventually, when enough people refuse to look away." Wade helped Thomas sit up enough to drink some water, then checked his injuries more carefully. The ribs were definitely broken, but the breaks seemed clean, no signs of internal bleeding. With rest and care, Thomas would survive. "Danny," Wade said, "your father needs someone with him. You should stay." "But Clara—" "I'll protect Clara. You have my word. But your father needs you here." The boy looked torn, glancing between his father and the direction of Wade's ranch where his sister waited. "Go to your sister," Thomas said weakly. "I'll be fine. Old man like me takes more than a beating to put me down permanent." "You're not old," Danny protested. "I'm tired and ashamed. But I'll live. You go help Wade protect your sister. That's the most important thing now." In the end, they compromised. Wade would take the evidence back to his ranch. Danny would stay with his father during the day, but ride to Wade's place each night, creating a relay of information and ensuring both Hayes' men had protection. Before Wade left, Thomas called him back one more time. "Wade, if anything happens to me, if Silas somehow gets to me before the trial, promise me you'll take care of my children." "Nothing's going to happen to you." "Promise me anyway." Wade looked at the broken man in the bed, saw the fear and love and desperate hope in his eyes. "I promise." The ride back to his ranch felt longer than 30 minutes. Wade's mind churned through possibilities and dangers. They had evidence now, real evidence. But evidence only mattered if they could get it to the right people, if they could protect Clara long enough to testify, if they could survive the next 3 days while Silas marshaled whatever resources he had left. When Wade arrived back at his ranch, Clara was sitting on the porch with the shotgun across her lap exactly as he'd left her. Her face brightened with relief when she saw him. "You're back." "I'm back, and I brought something." He dismounted, pulled the wrapped package from his saddlebag. "Evidence. Your mother's diary and a vial of what was probably poison." Clara took the diary with trembling hands, opened it, began to read. Wade watched emotions play across her face. Grief for her mother, rage at Silas, vindication that her suspicions had been right all along. When she finished reading, tears streamed down her face, but her voice was steady. She knew what he was doing, and she tried to stop it, tried to protect me. She was a brave woman. Like her daughter. Clara looked up at him. "Wade, I need to ask you something. Why are you doing all this? Really, it's more than just owing my father, more than just doing the right thing. What is it?" Wade sat down on the porch step beside her. The question deserved an honest answer. 10 years ago, I lost Margaret to a fever that came on sudden. I didn't question it, didn't investigate, just accepted that sometimes people die and there's nothing you can do about it. He paused. "But after I found that letter from your mother, after I started putting pieces together, I realized that maybe there was something I could have done. Maybe if I'd been paying attention, if I'd asked questions, if I'd connected the dots, I could have saved her. It's not your fault. Maybe not. But I failed her anyway. Failed to see what was right in front of me. Wade looked at Clara. When you came running to my ranch terrified and desperate, I saw a chance to not fail someone again. To actually protect someone instead of just burying them and pretending I'd done my best. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and took his hand. Her palm was warm against his, calloused from ranch work in ways that reminded him she wasn't just a frightened girl, but a woman who'd worked and struggled and survived. "You didn't fail Margaret," she said softly. "You didn't know. And even if you had known, Silas was careful, clever. He made it look natural. That's what makes him so dangerous." "I know, but knowing doesn't stop the guilt." "No, it doesn't." Clara squeezed his hand. "But maybe saving me can stop you from adding more guilt." They sat there as the sun climbed higher, two people bonded by loss and determination, by the need to make something right in a world that seemed determined to stay broken. The next 3 days passed in a state of heightened awareness, bordering on paranoia. Wade and Clara established a routine of vigilance. They took turns sleeping, took turns watching the approaches to the ranch, took turns preparing for violence that they hoped wouldn't come but expected anyway. Cole Turner visited once, riding in with his hands up to show he meant no harm. He examined the diary and vial with the careful attention of a man who understood evidence. "This is good," he said. "Very good. Combined with my investigation, we have a strong case. I've documented 3 deaths, all wives of Silas Blackwood. All died within 6 months of marriage. All showed similar symptoms." "Will it hold up in court?" Clara asked. "Depends on the judge. Silas has influence, but a federal court is harder to corrupt than local justice. And we have something he doesn't expect." "What's that?" Turner smiled grimly. "We have you, alive. He was so certain he'd get you back, so certain his plan would work. Now he's in custody facing murder charges, and the woman he thought he owned is about to testify against him. It's not the outcome he prepared for." On the 3rd day, Marshal William Hayes arrived from Austin. No relation to Thomas and Clara, just a coincidence of names that felt oddly appropriate. He was a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darkness to be easily shocked. He interviewed Clara for 3 hours, taking detailed notes, asking questions that seemed designed to find holes in her story. But Clara held firm, her answers consistent, her conviction unwavering. By the end, Marshal Hayes was nodding. "Miss, I believe you. And I believe we have enough to make this stick. But I need to warn you. The trial won't be easy. Silas's lawyer will try to paint you as hysterical, as vengeful, as a jilted bride making up stories. You'll have to be strong. I've run 2 miles barefoot in the summer heat. I've shot a man to protect my brother. I've faced down the man who killed my mother. I can handle a lawyer." The marshal actually smiled. "I believe you can." The trial was set for 2 weeks hence in Austin, where Silas's influence was minimal. In the meantime, Clara would stay at Wade's ranch under protection. Marshal Hayes stationed 2 deputies nearby just in case Silas had any remaining allies willing to attempt a rescue or retaliation. During those 2 weeks, something shifted between Wade and Clara. The crisis that had thrown them together evolved into something deeper. They talked long into the nights, sharing stories of loss and hope, of what they'd left behind and what they might build together. Clara told Wade about her mother's love of art, about learning to paint in secret, because Silas had disapproved of such frivolous pursuits. Wade told Clara about his years as a marshal, about the men he'd arrested, and the justice he'd tried to uphold, even when it was hard. Danny visited every few days, reporting that their father was healing slowly but surely. The boy was growing before their eyes, the crisis having forced him to become a man faster than childhood should allow. But he was handling it with grace and strength that reminded Wade of Clara. "You're teaching him well," Clara observed one evening after Danny had left for the night. "Teaching him survival, that's all." "No, you're teaching him to be a good man. There's a difference." Wade thought about that. Thought about the lessons he'd learned from his own father, Lessons about integrity and responsibility and standing up for what was right, even when it was costly. He'd tried to pass those lessons on to Danny not through lectures, but through example. "A man is what he does when nobody's watching," Wade said quietly. "That's what my father taught me. Do right because it's right, not because someone's keeping score." "Your father sounds like a good man." "He was. Hard but good. Honest. Fair. He would have liked you." Clara smiled, but there was sadness in it. "My father used to be good too, before the debt, before the desperation. Silas didn't just try to destroy me, he destroyed my whole family. But he didn't succeed. You're still here. Danny's still here. Thomas is healing. The family survives. Because of you." Wade shook his head. "I just gave you a place to stand. You did the surviving yourself." The night before they were scheduled to leave for Austin and the trial, Clara couldn't sleep. Wade found her on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the stars. "Nervous?" he asked. "Terrified. What if the jury doesn't believe me? What if Silas's lawyer is better than we think? What if he walks free and comes after us again?" Wade sat beside her. "Then we'll deal with it. Together." Clara turned to look at him. "Why do you say that, together? Like you're planning to stick around after this is over." "Because I am, if you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. It wasn't quite a proposal, not yet, but it was a promise, a commitment to whatever came next. "Wade Callahan, are you saying you want me to stay, even after all this is over, even when I'm not running from anyone anymore?" "I'm saying this ranch is too big for one person. I'm saying I'm tired of eating alone. I'm saying that somewhere in the last few weeks you stopped being a responsibility and started being important." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and he could feel her smiling. "Important. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." Wade chuckled. "I'm not good with words." "No, but you're good with actions, and actions matter more." They sat there under the stars, two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and discovered something worth protecting, something worth building on, something that felt like the beginning of a future neither of them had expected, but both of them wanted. The trial of Silas Blackwood began on a Tuesday morning in early July. The Austin courthouse was packed with spectators drawn by the scandal of a prominent doctor accused of murdering multiple wives. The local newspapers had been covering the story for weeks, each new revelation adding fuel to public fascination. Wade sat in the gallery behind Clara, who was positioned at the prosecution table with Cole Turner and a lawyer the federal government had provided. Across the aisle, Silas sat ramrod straight, dressed in an immaculate suit, his face a mask of wounded dignity. The prosecution built their case methodically over 3 days. They presented the diary. They presented the vial which had tested positive for arsenic. They presented medical records showing the pattern of deaths, all women married to Silas, all dying within months, all showing identical symptoms. Cole Turner testified about his investigation, about the inconsistencies he'd found about the witnesses who'd seen Silas administering medicine to his wives even as they grew weaker. Then it was Clara's turn. She took the stand dressed simply but with dignity, her hands steady as she placed them on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Wade watched her, proud of her strength, terrified for her vulnerability. Silas's lawyer was a sharp man from Dallas, expensive and experienced. He approached Clara with false gentleness, like a predator circling prey. "Miss Hayes, you were engaged to be married to my client, were you not?" "Yes." "And you ran away from your own wedding. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Tell me, Miss Hayes, isn't it true that you were simply suffering from wedding day nerves, that you panicked and made a rash decision?" "No. I ran because I knew if I married Silas Blackwood I would die, just like my mother died, just like his 3 wives died." "That's a serious accusation. What proof do you have that my client intended you any harm?" Clara met the lawyer's eyes steadily. "My mother's diary, the arsenic in the vial, the pattern of deaths, and my own instinct that told me I was looking at my future grave when I saw his previous wives' monuments. Instinct, not evidence, not fact, just a feeling. Sometimes a feeling is all you need to save your life. The lawyer tried different angles, tried to paint her as hysterical, as vengeful as a girl making up stories to justify abandoning her duty to her father's debts. But Clara held firm, her answers consistent, her conviction unshakable. When it was the prosecution's turn, they asked Clara to read portions of her mother's diary aloud. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she read her mother's words, her mother's fears, her mother's desperate attempt to protect her daughter, even from beyond the grave. By the time she finished, several members of the jury were wiping their eyes. Even the judge looked moved. Silas took the stand in his own defense, maintaining his innocence with calm rationality. He'd been a devoted doctor, he said. He'd tried to save his wives, his sister, but sometimes medicine failed. Sometimes people died despite best efforts. The accusations against him were the product of grief and misunderstanding. "I loved Rose," he said, his voice breaking with what seemed like genuine emotion. "She was my sister, my blood. Why would I harm her?" The prosecutor stood. "Because she defied you. Because she married Thomas Hayes against your wishes. Because in your twisted view of bloodline purity, she'd contaminated the family legacy." "That's absurd." "Is it? We have witnesses who heard you speak about bloodline purity, who heard you say that Clara Hayes needed to be brought back into the family, that the Hayes blood needed to be purified out of her." Silas's composure cracked. "I wanted to protect her, to give her the life she deserved, a life of education and culture and refinement, not struggling on a failing ranch with a drunk father, by poisoning her mother, by planning to do the same to her. I never poisoned anyone. But the damage was done. The jury had seen behind the mask, had glimpsed the fanaticism that drove Silas Blackwood's actions. The trial lasted 2 weeks total. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Silas stood frozen, unable to process that his careful plans, his meticulous execution, his certainty of his own righteousness had all led to this moment. Conviction. Judgment. Justice. The judge spoke, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Silas Blackwood, you have been found guilty of 3 counts of murder in the first degree, 2 counts of attempted murder and conspiracy. However, given the testimony regarding your mental state, your genuine belief in the righteousness of your actions, this court sentences you to life imprisonment in the state psychiatric facility rather than execution." It was a compromise. Not the hanging Silas probably deserved, but removal from society nonetheless. He would spend the rest of his days locked away with others whose minds had betrayed them into darkness. As the guards led him away, Silas looked at Clara one last time. "I would have loved you," he said quietly. "In my way, I would have loved you." "I know," Clara replied. "That's what makes it so terrible." Outside the courthouse, Clara collapsed into Wade's arms, tears of relief and grief pouring out. Danny was there too, having ridden from the ranch with Thomas despite his father's injuries. They stood together, a family forged not by blood, but by survival. "It's over," Clara whispered. "It's finally over." "Yes," Wade said. "Now we figure out what comes next." The old Wade Callahan fell silent. The spring afternoon had grown long shadows stretching across the porch. His grandson sat perfectly still, absorbing the weight of the story. "So you saved her," the boy said finally. "You and Grandma fought Silas and won." "We survived him," Wade corrected gently. "There's a difference. And we didn't do it alone. Your great-uncle Danny, your great-grandfather, Thomas Cole Turner, Marshall Hayes. It took a lot of good people to stop one bad man who believed he was righteous." The boy looked at the scar on Wade's hand again, understanding now. "And that scar, when did you get it?" Wade smiled. 3 months after the trial. I was building your grandmother's art studio, got careless with a saw. Nothing heroic. Just proof that sometimes the dangerous moments aren't the ones you prepare for." The boy laughed, then grew serious again. "Grandpa, Do you think Silas really loved Grandma Clara, even though he wanted to hurt her? Wade considered the question with the care it deserved. I think Silas loved an idea of her, loved what she represented to him. But real love, the kind your grandmother taught me, isn't about possession. It's about choice. Every morning for the past 15 years I've woken up and chosen her, and every morning she's chosen me back. That's love. Movement caught their attention. Clara emerged from the studio barn wiping paint from her hands, her silver hair catching the late afternoon light. Even at 57, she moved with the same determined grace that had carried her barefoot across 2 miles of prairie. "Are you filling that boy's head with tall tales again?" she called, but her eyes were warm. "Just telling him the truth, Clara, about the day you showed up in a torn wedding dress and changed everything." Clara climbed the porch steps and rested a hand on Wade's shoulder. To their grandson she said, "Your grandfather left out the best part of the story." "What's that, Grandma?" "That sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting. It's choosing. I chose to run. I chose to trust a stranger. I chose to testify. And 15 years ago I chose to marry a man who gave me something Silas never could." She squeezed Wade's shoulder. Freedom. The boy looked between them, these two people who'd survived darkness and built something lasting. "So what happened after the wedding, after you chose each other?" Wade and Clara exchanged a look, a lifetime of shared understanding passing between them. "We lived," Wade said simply. "We rebuilt the ranch. Your grandmother painted. Danny grew into a fine man, married, had children. Your great-grandfather Thomas found peace before he died. We made mistakes, had hard times, but we faced them together. That's what choosing each other means, not just once, but every day." Danny's voice called from inside the house. "Wade, Clara, dinner's ready, and the grandkids are getting restless." The boy jumped up. "Can I tell them the story, Grandpa?" "You can tell them what you remember. But remember this part most. Your grandmother didn't need saving. She needed someone to stand beside her while she saved herself. Big difference." As the boy ran inside, Clara settled into the chair beside Wade. They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun paint the prairie gold, the same prairie that had witnessed a terrified girl running toward freedom 15 years ago. "You told it well," Clara said softly. "I left out the parts that still give me nightmares." "Good. Let him remember the courage, not the fear." She took his hand, her fingers finding his. "Though I still say you were my hero that day. And you were mine, still are." Inside they could hear laughter. Danny's children, Clara's paintings on the walls, 3 generations gathering for a meal. The legacy they'd built together, not of blood and obsession like Silas had wanted, but of choice and love and the freedom to become who they were meant to be. Wade looked at his scarred hand and Clara's thought about the frightened girl who'd collapsed at his feet, the strong woman sitting beside him now. Thought about every choice that had led them here. "Ready to go in?" Clara asked. "Ready when you are." They stood together, these 2 survivors, these 2 choosers, and walked into their home filled with family and future. The prairie stretched endless behind them, golden in the dying light, witness to endings and beginnings, and the quiet truth that the best stories aren't about being rescued. They're about choosing freedom, choosing love, choosing every single day to stay, and living long enough to tell the tale to those who come after.